But today I'm super excited to be here. We've got Morgan Baynham-Williams as our first presenter in this room. She is a world champion, a European medalist. She's got a long list of victories, including in the boat race for Oxford, at Henley, and Head of the Charles. She's also a founding mentor at the Winning Cox. She has a bachelor's in sports science and a master's in musculoskeletal sciences from Oxford, and we are super excited that she's here with us today. She's going to be doing a lot of different talks, but this first one is on coaching the coxswain. So I'm going to just let you roll with it, Morgan.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So what we'll try and do is we'll get stuck in. We've got a fairly broad topic to sort of cover in this sort of 45-minute window. We'll try and factor in some questions that will stretch it out a little bit. And what I'll try to do is add a few pauses as we go through and change sort of different categories or topic areas so that you can ask away, ask any questions, and we can try and kind of evolve and keep up with the storyline as we go through. So we'll get stuck in. So here's a good introduction. So that was a great introduction for me. I'm one of the mentors at the Winning Cox, and that's their Instagram handle at the Winning Cox. So if you want to give them a follow, please do. We're 6 former international coxswains who are mentoring coxes and coaches around the world. The first point for me, and I think this is a big one to sort of drive home really, is coxes are athletes, or coxswains are athletes, and we've got to really try and make sure that we treat them that way. And that means you need to know and understand the job description of what it is you want your coxes to do, what the role is that they are trying to fulfill. And that means it helps you to think about the ways in which you coach them, the expectations you have for the role, and also how to formulate some form of assessments or selection periods. We want to set the boat up for them, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. And we want to have regular, consistent coaching and feedback that's both on the water and on land. I want to make sure you're allocating equal time for these athletes. So in just the same way that you might allocate time to go through something with rowers individually, you want to go through things with your coxswains individually. So the first one, the job description. Now, some people might think about this. This might be a completely new concept to some of you. You might have thought about it without even realizing. The job description is our greatest opportunity to ensure that your coxswains succeed. And this happens because we're going to be able to clearly define the roles and responsibilities, or the roles and requirements of your coxswain and your team. And what I mean by that is that can change team to team, that can change squad to squad, that might change from country to country. And nice and simply, this is an exercise that we want all coaches to do. And coxes, you can go and sit down with your coaches and actually go through this and try and think about it. And think about, okay, what are the objectives of the cox? What do we want them to do individually and also within the team or as a team of coxswains? And this might be to deliver the training program. What are the responsibilities? So that might be to maintain equipment. That might be to ensure the running of sessions. That might be to run the ergos. Whatever you want that to be, that's specific to your coaching or your team. And then the characteristics. So a nice obvious one is we want them to display leadership characteristics. And there'll be a little bit more detail on the coxswain job description in a whole separate webinar later on today. So you can find a little bit more about that. So this is where I want you to start off with. We want our minds thinking about what is the role and what are our expectations that we have for our coxswain to do within our team, collaboratively and individually. And this is a kind of prototype. So this is the first time that we are kind of launching this as the Winning Cox. So this might change when it actually goes out in publication, but you guys get a little sneak peek of this today. And this is what we think about when we're thinking of, we want to establish our job description. We need to understand our coxswain's priorities. Now, number one, the paramount priority is to be safe. Keep crews safe at all times on the water, in training sessions, in race, at practice. The other thing we want to make sure is that they're proficient in their steering and maneuverability. That's going to allow them to be safe. It's also going to allow them to run a session and to have a strategic element to their racing, the lines that they draw, where they put the boat, how they put the boat in the best possible water, so the rowers can do their best possible rowing. We're going to build off that with them having a strong technical understanding, and this grows throughout their exposure to the sport. And what ties in really nicely with that is we would probably have an expectation that they would become a student of the sport. And that means that any opportunity that exists to learn something from other practitioners, coaches, other coxes, physios, strength and conditioning coaches, biomechanists, anything, anywhere really where you can learn about the sport that's going to help you to verbalize and communicate your understanding of the way you want the rower to move. That's going to be essential in making your coxes better. We also want to make sure there's efficiency, that we're able to run sessions to time, we're able to get off to school afterwards, or we can get off to our classes. We want to make sure there's a huge collaborative element to this. Team first, individual second. The big final thing for me is that there's authenticity when we operate within all of these paradigms. So we don't want to see carbon copies of each other. We want the individual flair, the characteristics to shine through, that they execute the fundamentals of coxing whilst maintaining their own authentic self, their own personality and their own style. If I try to cox like another cox, I'll do a really bad job of doing it their way. But if I do it my way and execute the fundamentals, then I'll do a much better job of that. Before we move on to the on-water coaching, just in this early part, are there any questions about what we've just gone through there? I think that might be an all clear. Okay, brill. So what we'll try and feed in now is how our understanding of how the job description works and how our fundamentals guide into how we might actually build upon how we're coaching our coxswains on the water. So I think a picture speaks 1,000 words. This is a picture of me on the launch at UVA, and these are some of my coxswains on the launch with me. We've actually got one rower as well. For me, it's all about maximising the time that the coxes are able to spend with coaches, because the first thing you want to do when you join a new team is to learn the vocabulary of that team. And by that, I mean the way that we talk about rowing is different depending upon the team in which we're in, because the coach's vocabulary is different. And that might be from first boat to second boat to third boat. That might be from different collegiate programs. That might be from school to university. That might be nationalities. There are certainly words that I would say initially, before I learnt the lingo, that were the British terminology for different parts of coxing or different parts of rowing. So spending time on that water in the scenario where you're coaching live time and the coxes can ask you questions is so important. And you can also give them the freedom and the opportunity to do some coaching themselves, and you can start to have the conversations and build a bit of a vocabulary and a commentary around what you're trying to do. When we think about the water-based coaching, we're going to go through an idea of we want to set the boat up, we want the coxes to be in the right positions, we want to be able to coach the steering fundamentals, to focus on fleet management, having those opportunities again on the launch for the shadowing, driving the launches is so good for teaching those steering skills, and then thinking about how that influences our race strategy and race steering. This is one of my favourite things, setting the boat up. We always set the boat up for the rower. We adjust their feet, we adjust the seat height, we change the angle, we change the height of the gate, pitch, no pitch, whatever you want. We change it all around, and then we just expect the coxes to get in the boat, just sit in there, be comfortable. You can see, of course you can, off you go. All you've got to do is sit there and steer. And actually, it can be really uncomfortable. Your legs can go numb. You might not be able to see anything. Your arms might be longer than the other cox that were sat in there before. They might be shorter, so you can't reach the steering wires, or the steering wires are too far behind you. If you're in the wrong position, you're not going to be poised. You're going to be moving around. You'll generate check. All of these factors come in and influence how well you're able to steer the hull, how well you're able to feel it, how well you're able to call and dictate or try to feel actually what's going on with the boat. So 2 ways we can think about how we set the coxswain up is, first of all, if we go with the bow loader, so that's the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, we want to be sat where we've got some support across the back of our shoulders. Our feet are going to be pressed against something at the end of the compartment. If they don't reach, probably you're going to do one of two things. Things like the Hudson, you've got a movable neck support, and you might move that forwards or back, and that's going to give you a bit more access to the bottom of the footboard. There are also sometimes some foot toggles, so you can bring the foot plate to you. If that doesn't exist, stick something a piece of foam relatively firm down there for you to press your feet against. And then we want to be supported under our shoulders, so have a check of how you fit within the boat. If you're not quite the right size, just sticking a bit of foam behind your back can help you, or a boat tie as a bit of leverage, a bit of support is great. And then the last thing we want to think about is you don't actually want dead straight legs. You want a little bit of a bend in the knee, and sometimes just putting something foamy and supportive underneath your knees is going to allow that bend to exist, and that will let you feel the boat more. So if you're fully tensed out in a straight line, you're really stiff and you will not be able to feel the hull. What we want is a nice relaxed position where we're supported, but we've got contact points with the hull, so we can feel the surge, we can feel how it's moving, the check, when the boat gets picked up, when we're accelerating. We want to be able to feel and build those sensations. The picture on the right, we're thinking about how we set ourselves up in an 8. And the same sort of thing goes here. So I often coxed in waterproof socks if it was cold. So I never coxed in shoes. And this is because it can be really quite challenging to fit your feet either side of where either the cox box or the cox orb or whatever amplifying unit you're using sits. We want to be able to have our feet on the board, on the decking of the hull, so we can feel what's going on. Next thing you want to think about is the flexibility of your coxswain's hips and hamstrings. Have they got long legs? Have they got short legs? It might help to prop them up on a little bit of a seat pad. So I quite often sat on a raised seat. Not only does that give me better visibility, but it also means that the positioning I'm in is much more comfortable. I'm in sport mode rather than sort of sat back in an armchair, rocking back and forth. And then the final thing is thinking about moving the handles in which you hold on to. My personal preference was to have my arms almost straight, a bit like when you go to drive a car, you've got a little bit of a bend in your elbows. So to have my arms out straight in front of me, nice and even, I had longer arms than other coxes, so I needed to move the handles. That meant I was in a comfortable position, could hold myself still, could feel what was going on within the boat. Another thing to think about is you might get a bit creative and you might have a cox with poor hip mobility, very tight hamstrings. So you might have a slightly tilted seat pad that they sit on, so a little bit of an angle in the exact same way you would do with a rower that would have difficulty compressing. The coxswain's going to be sat compressed pretty much for a long time, so give them a bit of angle to make them a bit more comfortable. Setting your cox up before you do anything is going to elevate the quality of the work that they're able to do. It also shows straight away that you are giving them the time of day, and that's so important. This is a lovely little picture of me setting up a coxswain from with the Welsh rowing team. Just put a trestle underneath her, and I'm actually just adjusting the shoulder strap so that she's nice and supported to go out and race and be able to feel the hull still. So coxes tend to be relatively small. You can fit the trestle or the slings underneath them and be nice and supported either side. Got some people to stabilize the boat, you can do those sort of things and make sure their measurements are all right. The same thing as you can do it on the water as well. Okay, the teaching structure. So I think it's important to think about when we're training or coaching our coxes that we're trying to teach them. Never assume that they know the answer. Give them the opportunity to show you that they know. And I want to try and encourage the thought process of we're going to explain the theory, we're going to have some sort of drill to support that theory, and then there is a practical element that gives them an opportunity to execute this. And this might be, say we're trying to explain teaching, and you might go out and explain the hazards and the risks, and you do that on land, you might do it around the boathouse, you might do it standing there looking at the waterfront. And then you want them to think about how we're going to progress to exposing them on the water, take them out on the launch, show them how the launch responds to the stream around them if you've got stream where you are, maybe how it responds to the wind. What does the wind do to the boat at different angles? How is that influencing us? And then the drill element might be you're going to ask your coxswain to use the stream to turn the boat around. And you're going to do this by pointing the bow into the stream. What's the practical application of this? Well, it means that in a racing perspective or a training perspective, that you know and you understand that your cox can safely turn the boat using the stream. An awesome example for us is if we think about the boat race. That's on the River Thames, it's tidal. It's really strong, really powerful. And you want to be able to turn the boat safely. And you want to do that by pointing your bow into the stream. And so when we start any races there, we use the stream to turn the boat, and it means we end up in the optimum position to be able to start the race on the right course, and that gives us the best chance from the very beginning to have our fastest time. And you can play around with things of how you might kind of teach these things. So your theory behind it might be explaining holding water, and you give them drills to do that where they build up speed and almost do an emergency stop like you might do in a driving lesson, teaching how you might hold your boat or hold the bow still going against the stream, holding position when you're marshalling for events or races. Same thing goes for a headwind. So if the wind's blaring against you and you want to hold the boat still whilst you're marshalling and waiting to start an event, practicing just holding the hull stationary and still in your position is going to be so useful for those race days. Teaching steering. This is the fun part, I think. So we want to think about some fundamentals of steering and how that actually works. And for me, these involve pointing your bow, and that means pointing the actual bow of the boat, the actual bow ball at headings, being able to pick out what these headings are. And to start with, you might have to explain what the headings are. And then over a period of time and repetition, you start to be able to develop the skill set to pick those headings out yourself. Thinking about parallel lines, and then performing a visual sweep. And so what does this look like? Pointing your bow or asking the question, where is your bow, can be used in races where there's no buoy line. So usually river races, that could be head of the Charles, prime example. The example we've got on the screen here is the boat race between Oxford and Cambridge. And the bow is currently pointing at a building. And what happens is different types of building or different types of headings are used by the coxswain to ensure that they're going in the right place. They're pointing the bow at the right location so they can form the smooth turns or the lines at which they're trying to draw. Now, the different colours of the orange on the screen here and the arrows represent how the headings change the further down the track you get. So you're not holding a heading for too long. You hold it for a moment in time, and then you're moving to the next one, and then the next one. And that keeps you on a continuous course of progression and development down the track and not going off-piste. A really useful thing for you to think about is how you might use headings on your training stretch. And there's going to be headings of where you want to point that bow for the coxswains or for your coxless boats at all points in time when you're on the track. So that might be teaching your stroke seat about how they watch the stern when they're in a coxless boat, and they might line that stern up. Or about how you teach your coxswains to point their bow at, it might be a very distinct tree that you have on your training course or training stretch, and how that keeps them in the best position. Parallel lines. This feeds in really nicely to our headings and where we're pointing our bow. So this is a nice little snapshot from the Windermere Cup. And in this race, you've got headings, but you're also trying to stay parallel to either the line of boats that are marking out the track and honking their horns and sounding their cannons, or parallel to the shoreline. And we do the same thing when we're in training. We do the same thing when we're racing. It's really important that you're able to look ahead, plot your headings, and also look and see, is your hull parallel to the shoreline? When do I want to be parallel? When do I want to lose that and let it turn into more of a sweep or a turn? Or when do I not want to get sucked into the bank? So taking time when you're on your courses, when you're in your training environments, to think about areas of opportunity, practical scenarios that present when you do want to be parallel to the shoreline, or when you don't want to follow that cut in because that's actually going to take you a longer route, and that's not where we want to be. And so thinking about how a heading might come into play there, or how we look ahead to read the water, to think about how we're going to put the boat in the best possible position. The other thing we think about with parallel lines is when we're coxing in groups, so that might be 3 abreast. In these scenarios when we don't have a buoy line or a buoy line to line ourselves up against, the crew or the coxswain that's closest to the shoreline is going to be the lead. And by that, I mean that it's easiest for them to get their hull parallel to the shore. And so the coxswain next to them is going to take their line off them. So if they aren't concentrating and holding a parallel line to the shoreline, this coxswain next to them, who's taken a guide off them, is going to struggle to keep their lines parallel. We can try to do a really outstanding job as coxswains where we can be very much on the outside, look ahead and still keep parallel to the shoreline with 4 crews in the middle of us. But it really, really, really helps if we know that there's good communication and collaboration between coxes or coxswains and that we're able to hold that line and be really clear in what we're aiming for and having real predictability on what we're trying to do. I'm just checking the question chat here, and we've got one about suggestions of where to acquire an angled seat pad. I actually don't know about manufacturers that make these things. These are always things that I've just made myself or made for my coxes or made with my coaches when I was coxing myself. It might be getting a piece of foam and cutting a very thin layer off at an angle and seeing how much that helps. It might be actually going to see a physio and them actually giving you a way more accurate angle or measurement that you might need for that. It could just be playing around with how you stuff little bits of sponge in there to sit on, but it's a bit of a trial and error thing because it's not really thought about. It's not really designed yet. It might come into play. I don't know. Maybe someone on this call has got the engineering to work that out, and that would be awesome. Brill. The next important thing for me is our visual sweep, or where is the coxswain looking? And so when I describe a visual sweep, I'm thinking about we want to look to our left, and we're going to look around to our side, ahead of us, where's our bow going, back around to the other side, and we're going to make sure we look behind us. So what coxswains often forget to do is look behind. And there's so much information that you can use when you're racing or when you're training to what's happening behind you, just as much as when you're looking ahead at what's happening in front of you. So we want a full visual sweep, and that means that in that one look, I have seen that we're coming up to the 500-meter marker. I've seen the crosswind coming in. It's going to come in from port side. I'm going to ask starboard to squeeze up through the next few finishes, and I know that our next move is going to be a little bit sharper around the front. So squeezing up and setting the boat up is going to help us going into that 600-meter move. And currently we're in second position. So I'm going to see if in 10 strokes time, that takes us into first. And that's all from one look. I've not said any words at that point in time because I've just been formulating this information. By looking around, you get a bit of an idea. And that one final check behind you, you get to see the water coming off the stern of your hull, ideally if you're in an 8. If it's nice and solid, you can see the track you've gone. Yep, I'm going in a straight line. Okay, we're doing a good job. I know that crosswind's coming up, so I'm going to try and hold this straight line, see how we get on there. You might see that you've kind of tailed along a little bit, your cox has tailed along. You think, okay, right, I need to really, really hold this line and help them out here. So doing a visual sweep, thinking about where things are, gives you so much opportunity in trying to elevate what you're doing. So how else do these things come together when we're racing? So pointing our bow and parallel lines. This is a overhead shot of the boat race. It shows you a very, very wide waterway. This little island on the left of your screen is just an island. The actual riverbank is quite a lot further past this. And so the coxes are holding parallel lines to the shoreline. At this part of the course, they're trying to be parallel to the little island, or they call it an ayot. And they're also trying to point their bow into the distance. What's happened in this picture is we've actually got our bows slightly pointing into each other. And that means unless someone corrects and goes and adjusts their heading, we're going to have a clash, a collision. And so when you think about a boat race umpire, what they're often looking at is where is the bow pointing? And if the bow is pointing across the waterway into the other line of the other crew, then there's a likely that that's going to be a collision, which would be a foul. And the same goes for your training scenarios when you're trying to run multiple crews side by side. We want to have parallel lines and we want to point our bow at our heading. But if our bow is pointing into the other crew's water, at some point there's going to be a collision. And that might be in 4 strokes time. It might be in 2 strokes time. So we want to encourage looking ahead and thinking about what our coxswain's aiming for. And it gives you a nice thing to sit behind them when you're coaching and following them and to talk to them about. So at the moment, your bow is on a trajectory that's pointing into our other crew. Look ahead, see if you can correct your heading. What might be a better thing to aim for? And try and think about explaining when they're doing it wrong, explaining when they've done it a bit better, and explain it when it's definitely better. Because what often happens with coaching coxswains is that coxswains will be told when they're doing it wrong. They don't often get told when they're doing it right or a little bit better. That's so important. We want to be able to learn both. What we don't want to know is that because you haven't said anything, we're just doing an all right job. We want to do an awesome job. We want to do an outrageously good job. Silence could be assumed that it's, yeah, that's good, that's great, or it's okay. When you go, no, that's not right, we know it's definitely not right. So being really clear of, yeah, you know what, that's the right idea. I can see the progress there, or that is a change. That's a real difference. That is exactly what I'm looking for. So nice and clear, nice and explicit. Just going to have a little check on the question box if I can find it again. Ah, it's a good suggestion of a phone. Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, so how might we teach steering? Same again, so the theory. We're going to use pictures to show the headings that you want your coxswains to aim for. That might be an air conditioning unit on the top of a building at the Charles course. And we're going to take them out and either on a launch to start with or in the boat, try and get them to aim for those headings. It might also be using the buoy line on a buoyed course or the buoy line to as a marker of what you want them to be parallel to. Your drill then might be, okay, we're going to start by being, 1 meter or 1 foot, 2 foot off the buoy line. And then we're going to make it 3 foot, make it 4 foot, make it 5 foot. And we want to keep the cox parallel to that buoy line. As they get further and further away, are they able to think about a heading they might hold to be able to hold that angle? And how are we developing that? What happens if we make it a little bit harder and we put a crew in the middle of them and we want them to still be parallel? So creating training scenarios or drills in exactly the same way that we would give the rowers drills to try and improve technical elements of their rowing, of their movement pattern. We're trying to think of creative ways in which we can incorporate drills into the practice session, into the training program, that the coxswains are able to practice these key elements of their skill sets. Practical takeaway, your coxswain's able to be parallel to the shoreline. They can pick out, hold and let go of headings at the right time. And it's going to put the boat in the best possible water to allow the rowers to do their best possible rowing. Okay, before we move on to the on-land part, any questions, feel free to ask or write them in the box. Could be anything. All right, take that as a note. Okay, so on land. I've already showed you here. It's quite handy in a presentation because you get to see the sort of stills or the images we might use to coach from. So there's a series of different things in the same way when we coach the rowers that we can use to coach the coxes. So still pictures, that is the overhead shots of where they are on the course. That might be the headings. That might be a picture of the water running off their stern. Same with the video of their stern when they're coxing. Is the water moving around a lot? That could be they're applying the rudder. What is the kind of the water shadow that's left behind of their steering trace? taking pictures of that, videoing them taking a turn, looking at their headings, sitting down with them, going through these things. So, okay, this is quite good here. We probably want to be a little bit closer to the starboard shoreline in this part of the course. Why don't you try aiming for that cherry-looking tree in the distance? Nice and clear. You showed them what was good, what wasn't so good, how we can improve upon that. You can also use different elements, and we'll go through some of these of kind of GPS traces to help them with the steering. We want to talk about recording analysis, and think outside the box when you're thinking about your ergo coaching or your ergo sessions, your gym sessions, and shadowing opportunities that exist. So, for example, that might be you want to run a set of timepieces on the ergometer, and you want the Cox to run through those timings with rate changes. That's a very easy way for them to think about their timing of their audio, of what they're trying to do when they're working on their recordings. And that's on land in a controlled environment. The same sort of thing you could do is having a Cox come and shadow you in your coaching on land. That's a great opportunity for them to work on the collaborative terminology that they have within the team. So use the same vocabulary in your coaching when they're coxing in the boat and when you're coaching from the launch. And then mentorship opportunities. There is a huge wealth of knowledge out there. There are former elite international coxswains in the US, globally, who are really, really willing to help. National championship winning coxswains, just reaching out. I think what's amazing about the coxswain community is they love to help each other. Tap into that, and that can be so beneficial in the development of what you're trying to do with your team, what you're trying to do with your team of coxes, what you're trying to do with your coaching kind of vocabulary, and how you bring about change performances. Just trying to check the questions here. What calls have you found to be best and most effective at the start of a sprint race? This is an interesting one. We can go through this. I'll go through that in a little bit when we go through the recording analysis element. Good question. An environment where we have too few coxswains or novice coxswains. Side effects, experience and novice crews. Okay, so this is talking about, there's a question about environments where you've not got that many coxswains. You've got quite a lot of novice coxswains that come through and they're asked to cox in crews right away. And it means they're often dealing with novice crews themselves that they're coxing and how best to handle this. So I think it's just sticking to the basics. In the same way that with your novice rowers, you're thinking about the basics elements to the rowing technique, you're thinking about the basic principles of coxing. So number one, the fundamental is they're safe at all times. In order to be safe, they must understand the commands, be able to say the right command at the right time. Both the coxswain and the rowers have to understand that. And they need to be able to have a basic ability to steer the boat. So point the bow, use the rudders, be set up comfortably in their coxing position and offering them guidance. And then not rushing it. These things take time, these things take practice. In the same way that you go slow, you know, you might be an 8, you might be rowing in pairs, rowing in 4s. Doing that instead of going straight to whole crew is a great way to let your cox kind of gradually pick up and progress as you go through. But there's no fast track to any of these sort of things. All right. So race steering. This is the wonderful Google Earth. And it is a GPS track of my steering from when I was training for the boat race. So you can do this with any sort of GPS tracking that you have. That might be Strava, that might be the Coxswain GPS actually tracks a training trace itself, and you can load it afterwards. But this gives you an idea of you're able to see where the deepest channels are in the river. So the darkest parts with the water in, those are the deepest channels. And we're going to want to be pretty much centrally to those areas of the track. Then what you can do is you can go back over this trace afterwards So if I was coaching me, I'd sit myself down, or the coach would sit me down and say, do you know what? You were probably, if we look from the right of the screen to the left, because that's the direction of travel, Morgan, you were probably too close to the starboard shoreline, to the Aya at the beginning there, but then you did find your way to get back on track into the centre and maintain relatively the inside of the centre around the turns and the centre through the bridge. So it gives you a nice way to think about, okay, this is what I've done. This is where I am. And then go, why do you think these things happened? I just didn't start in the right place. But then once I got going, I got myself in a better position. Or, yeah, there was a really strong crosswind at the start and it just pushed me onto the Aya and I just didn't know what to do to handle it. And then you can have a conversation of, right, okay, how might we deal with that next time round? And then if you're on the water and you spot there's a crosswind, great, okay, perfect. We're going to put the hull into the crosswind and we're going to play around with this and see what we can learn. So you can learn a lot of things from steering traces. I've seen some awesome ones of the head of the Charles. They're great to look at. And ask other coxswains for their steering traces. You can see where they've been, how they've done it, how they've set it up, entry angles, exit angles. You can get very geeky about this stuff. So it's more data to look at. Recording analysis. This is a good one. So this is something that every cox needs to do, but the best coaches in the world take the time to go through the coxswain's recordings with them. That is fundamentally fact. It's the best way for both the coxswain and the coach to learn. It really doesn't need to take that long. Aiming for once a week shouldn't be too much to ask. And to start with, you want the coxswain to come to you with just a short section. That could be 2 minutes, 3 minutes long. It might be, if it's a race recording, it could be the first 2 minutes of the race. It could be a middle 2 minutes. It could be the sprint 2 minutes. You might even go in a logical order. This week, we'll go through the first 2 minutes. Next week, we'll go through the middle. Week after that, we'll go through the last two. If you've only got 2 minutes of time and you give them 3 minutes, great. If you've got 5 minute window, you can listen to a 2 minute recording, you can think for a minute, then you can give them feedback for 2 minutes. If you've then got a bit more time, you might go through a whole race recording. This is definitely something you want to do when you've settled on your race cruise and you're going into a championship event. So you might end up having a cox that you haven't worked with before that's coxing your crew for the championships. You want to know their style, how they're doing it, what's their recording, what's their vocabulary. Go through it with them. Go through a whole race with them. Go through it with them if you've got time after their heat, before their semi. How can they make it better? At the start, you sounded really nervous, but actually, once they got into their rhythm, you relaxed too, and you came into your rhythm. Like, I want to see that earlier on. I want to see that confidence, that calm tone, a little bit earlier in the race. So, do you think we could put that in? That call wasn't very clear. That's our big move. That has to be clear. What does that mean? Could I take that out? Does it need to stay? We can also go through recordings of our training sessions. And that's a really good way to think about how our technical model is being articulated throughout the team. And what are we looking for? So we want clear structure, and this is for either a training session, so in practice, or this is for racing. We want clear structure. So are they going through the session plan? Are they going through the race plan? Boat feel. Are there elements of understanding of the technique and feeling and reading the hull? Are they aware of what's going on around them? The tone. Does what they're saying and how they're saying it match? Are they asking someone to relax, but they're saying it in a really aggressive, very stressed, unrelaxed manner? And then relevance. Is it actually relevant to the race? Is it actually relevant to the training session at that point in time? If you want to get really clever with it, match it to a race video, and then you can have actual live visual feedback of what was going on and how relevant that is when we're moving through. I'm going to go back to a question here that was about what calls have I found best or most effective for the start of a sprint and a sprint race. going to take this question as one of two things. One, either about calls in the start of a race, and I actually don't say many at all. My opinion is if the rowers can't remember the first 5 strokes, then we've probably got a larger problem than the outcome of the race. They should be pretty clear on their first 5 strokes. And then it means that the words that you say really make a difference. Or if it's about starting the sprint of a kind of shorter race and how moving through it, again, I think simpler is better. So there will be a very clear process of how you're going to sprint, how you're going to execute that race, make the calls process orientated so that they do the thing that they need to do in order to create the outcome. If you're asking for an outcome, then there's going to be a delay because they're going to have to think of the process themselves of what they need to do in order to get that outcome. So simple is better and process orientated. Another question we've got here is apply the rudder only while oars are in the water and not on the recovery. I actually don't do this. In my experience and from other coxes I've asked, this isn't a thing. If you're only putting the rudder on when the blades are in the water, that means you're going along kind of like twitching and feathering around like you've got Nemo's lucky fin. And I just don't think that will help. That offsets the hull. The way I always steered, the way I know other internationals steer, is you just apply a little bit of the rudder, and there's going to take an amount of time. It might be 1 stroke, it might be 2 strokes for the hull to start to respond. Once you feel that bite, then the boat's responding and it's in the palm of your hands and it's moving. You can guide it. You can go back to being straight. You can apply a little bit of different direction. I wouldn't say start by slamming it on, just small movements, and you might have to hold it on for a little bit, but there's not a lot of moving about. When you're trying to stay straight in a crosswind, always thinking about you're going to point the bow into the wind, and that's going to help you hold your line. So you're always going to be pointing a little bit into the wind, and that's how you're going to stay in the center of the buoy line. There's not really another way to go down the track. If you can tell me that there's a cox that there's a crosswind and they just hold the rudder straight and they still go straight, then they're a miracle worker, and that's outstanding. But yeah, don't be afraid to steer. I think the biggest misunderstanding is that in order to steer straight, you don't need to steer. In order to go straight, you must steer. And that doesn't mean that you're steering all the time, but at some point you have to put the rudder on. All right, back to our race recording. So a really useful thing you can do is to plot your calls that you make during the race against a speed chart. So most people have got a speed chart, or most people have got a GPS that gives them the speed at which they're going at. If you haven't got one of those coaches, then what you can do is you can time them per 250 on the bank, and then you can work out what speeds they're going at. And this is a little bit of a representation of a very old race plan. I think this is maybe one of my early U23s. It looks very U23. And so it's our speed when it's going, when the graph lines are going up, it's getting quicker, and down, it's getting slower. Got a distance as we're progressing through the track, and you can see where we have gone quickly, where we've lost speed, where we've gained speed, and how the calls reflect to that. And it gives you a great kind of visual representation of what calls are actually making a difference, what calls aren't making a difference. Do we need to change something in our race plan? Where are we dropping a lot of speed? Should we think about something else? And this brings us really nicely into our coxswain's portfolios. So I think this is something so simple in a way, but brings so much value that a coach can offer to a coxswain. And by that I mean you're pulling together little bits of feedback, little bits of performance tracking into a PDF that you can give to each individual coxswain, and they can see how they're getting on and how they're progressing through things. So the picture we've got here is a really easy example of a coaching feedback form. You've got 5 coaches that are giving feedback to one coxswain from 5 different questions, and this might have been like steer safely and effectively in all training, and you rank that from 1 to 5. And it gives you a little explanation below down of kind of how that is. The other areas might be executes drills and maneuvers the hull effectively and appropriate pace for the present scenario. So they're efficient in the sessions. They've got clear communication, demonstrates an understanding of the rowing stroke and desired technique, and is able to execute all of these things, all of these fundamentals, with a tactical element. So they're strategic in its execution. And then ranking them 1 to 5, and you can see where they shake out, show them areas of improvement, go through this with them, and then you can also show them maybe in 2 months' time, we do the same review and see how they've progressed. Another way to do this is you can then have all of your coxswain's results in a little kind of matrix on your screen, and you can see where their strengths and the weaknesses are within the team, what the team average is, and be like, okay, do you know what? Like, as a team, we seem to be really quite good at our communication, the vocabulary that we're using, but we could be a little bit better in our steering, and we could be a little bit better in how we stick to our time and how efficient we are. And so you could set that as your next working target or the next goal for the following month of training. You bring that into your coxswain meetings, that's an objective, and you keep trying to work towards that. So it's very clear and actionable of what you're trying to do. This is an example of a recording progression portfolio. So this is simply scoring a recording from maybe 1 to 10. You could go 1 to 5. You could make it your own kind of scaling, whatever you want. And you're assessing different elements of the recording and how they perform on those. So in this scenario, this coxswain's got pretty good boat feel. The volume is good. The demand is good. Their confidence could be a little bit better, and I reckon they could improve their race strategy through making their structure better. This is completely made up, but this is kind of how that could work. Again, it's another visual representation of how you can see the development and the progression of your coxswain. And ideally, you're going to fill out that shape that you're looking or you're working towards. When we give feedback to our coxes, we want it to be actionable. If we're giving it real time on the water, that's the fastest way to make a change. There's more structured or detailed feedback can happen on land. Make sure that we follow the philosophy of encouraging, teach, and facilitate. If your feedback doesn't offer any of those things, just simply don't give it. We're all trying our best, and we want to make sure that we're facilitating that growth and the development. Be patient when you give your feedback, especially off the water. You want the same patience and etiquette that you'd offer to a rower. And using videos and pictures is such a valuable way to help the coxswain understand what they're doing and what you want them to do. The last bit for that is just be clear. If you don't understand what you want from them, they won't understand what you want from them. Last little bit for me before I come on to some final questions is create time for your coxswains to do their own exercise or their own activity. This was revolutionary for my coxing. It just gives you the headspace and the freedom to think about things. I would often find myself out going for a little jog or a little jog, and thinking about changes, thinking about how I might point my bow and actually working the problems out. Having that space and time is so useful, so important. And the other thing is that land training is a great opportunity for them to join in with the rowers. It's so good for that team morale, team motivation. Also, it helps them to understand the movement patterns. And then when they go to articulate a change from the rowers in the boat, they're able to understand what needs to move differently, how that might feel. All right, that's the end from me for this. We've got about 9 minutes before we get cut out, so feel free to ask away any questions. You can ask them in the chat box. I think you can ask them audibly. But yeah, no question is a bad question, and just go for it.
And I'll just say, Morgan, I think thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and information. And I think your experiences. Oh, we have a request for the QR code on that last slide. Anyway, I think this is this is really helpful because as we were talking beforehand, a lot of coaches have a lot of coxswains that they have to deal with. And for some, if they weren't a coxswain, it's sometimes an unknown quantity that I think it's great that we're providing this opportunity to discuss. So Jody has a question. Do you have a suggestion of when during a typical practice to try and give this type of feedback to the coxswains, or is it done separately from practice?
So, if it's, so I always think like this, if it's something they can change there and then, tell them there and then. So if they're pointing their bow into the bushes and they're going to crash, or they're pointing their bow into another crew, just ask them. So one of my best ever coaches would be like, Morgan, where is your bow? And then I would be like, oh God, and then would straighten up. And it can be very repetitive, but it makes you aware that you always have to be on it, because what you want is you want that cox racing that is like, bang, right, okay, I know where I'm looking, or I know what I'm looking at. When it's the more detailed analytical stuff, I would arrange a time to sit down and go through it. Because what you don't want is someone to take a look at it and then misunderstand it or misinterpret it and hit panic stations and really worry. I think you want to sit down, go through it together. It's all about building this team, building this communication so that we can continue to develop. The more that we understand what we're trying to do from both parties and how we can execute that, then we're able to move through these progressions so much faster. And I think it gives you you'll probably experience a new level of high performance coxing, and that's what we want to look for. I think also, and I'm sure that coaches on the call, you're going to absolutely hate me for this, but if you get in and cox a session, you will answer so many of your own questions about how to coach coxes, because you'll be like, God, like this is uncomfortable. I can't fit in this seat. This is horrible. I'm trying to ask someone to do this and they're not even sat in that seat. I don't know what I'm looking at. I forgot to steer. I've just crashed into that buoy. What are we working on? How many strokes are we in? And all those things will go through your head. And then you'll think about, okay, well, if I'm going to structure something, or if I want to improve a certain area, you'll have a bit more of an understanding of how to do it. In the same way that I think it's so important that a coxswain experience the third 500. Most coxes hate doing a 2K. I think it's so valuable. It teaches you what to say in the race. It teaches you what not to say in the race, because when you're experiencing your own third 500, you think about what you wouldn't want to hear at that point in time, and then you're probably not going to say it. So doing the things that are a little bit uncomfortable sometimes give us the answers very quickly.
I think that's great feedback, and that really reflects what Mary and Pete were saying earlier this morning, is to try and experience it all. Like experiencing it ourselves is one of the best learning tools that we can have. We've got some positive feedback in the chat. Does anybody have any more questions? And it's okay if you don't have more questions. Oh, here we go. Edwin has one. Do you structure time to spend just training cox versus running practice with rowers?
And I should probably specify that. So usually on water practice, you can put, let's say your novice coxswains with very experienced varsity crews. Do you spend time knowing that we have kind of a limited set of time and resources? Like, do you spend time just saying, we're just going to be paddling around so the cox can really get the idea of the feel and kind of the idea of where a boat actually, the bow actually points?
Mm-hmm. I actually think you can do both at the same time. And that is because you can explain to the rowers that if they're not rowing in time, it's actually really hard to steer. And I feel like I can say that and you know, not get gypped for it. But if the timing's off, you know, if they're throwing the weight around, it's really difficult for the coxswain to steer. And so you can create this kind of environment or ecosystem where both parties are learning, and that might be you're asking the rower to do something differently, and then explaining, did you see that change? You know, how can you feel the difference to the hull? Asking your coxswain that question, then you'll instantly teach them about boat feel. It might be slowing it down and going through some work in sixes, that might be part of the session. And that's going to give you a bit more time to put the boat in a certain direction, or to point the bow a little bit. So I think you can do a little bit of both. Certainly the warm-up is a great time to explain a few things. Just do a bit of back and forth, because you want the rowers and the cocks to be tuned into your voice. When someone thinks that they're not going to be spoken to, they've switched off, and so they're not present. And we need to be present all the time. And I always think the best sessions, you have both physically and mentally tired yourself out by being really on it, being really on that moment. So I think you can do both at the same time. If you want to, you can specifically offer it to the coxswain, but I do really think you can do both. And that might be you might be running a turn multiple times. Well, the rowers are still rowing and they're still practicing how they turn the boat. Rowing is, thankfully, a very repetitive sport, so the rowers do the same thing all the time anyway. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So just a couple minutes left if you have any other questions. I will note that Morgan is with us for most of the day. So she's got a few other sessions, I think 3 other sessions that she'll be giving. So I know we're going to learn a lot more from her throughout the rest of the day. So I think unless anything else pops up here, I think it's okay if we end a few minutes early, give Morgan a little break and all of us a little time to get another cup of coffee, maybe take a bathroom break. You guys were a little bit immune to it in here. Oh, one more that we can squeeze in. Any other suggestions to help a novice coxswain when they initially get on the water?
Just be patient. Understand the safety, understand the commands, and from there, be methodical in being patient, keeping it simple, and progressing from there. It's just the same way that you're patient with a novice rower.
That's great. Well, we will end it there. I will say we had some link issues from some of the other sessions that you guys were hopefully immune to in here, because this linked work. I just double checked everything. So if you guys by chance have any other link issues, please let me know as soon as you experience them, because I'm working hard to try and fix them. But thank you, Morgan. I think that was great. I look forward to hearing from the rest of your sessions today, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon.